Hi, I'm Jeffrey Clemens, an associate professor of economics at the University of California, San Diego.
And I'm Stan Voiger, senior fellow in economic policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Jeff and I are here to answer a few questions about our paper, Lessons from COVID-19 Aid to State and Local Governments for the Design of Federal Automatic Stabilizers, which is published by the Aspen Economic Strategy Group in the policy volume, Economic Policy in a More Uncertain World.
So the core issue relates to the way that key responsibilities in the United States are divided between the federal, state, and local governments. State and local governments play a central role in both financing and delivering many important public services, but they do so subject to balanced budget requirements, with the implication being that when downturns lead to decline in state and local revenue streams, that can force these state and local governments to pull back on services during these recessions, arguably when service needs are running particularly high. Unlike the states, the federal government is not bound by balanced budget requirements and indeed seems to be quite effective at running deficits, which is why it plays a central role in the macroeconomic stabilization function of governments. And so it's this key difference in the ability to run deficits that sets up a reasonably strong argument that one of the federal government's roles during recessions should be to provide at least some amount of fiscal assistance to the state and local governments.
Well, what ended up happening, I'd say broadly speaking, is that really every state received overwhelming federal aid. There were some biases, I think, along lines of congressional representation in how much money each individual state really received. But I don't think either Jeff or I would argue that any state really ended up with a shortfall of combined assistance and regular revenue. Now, the economic effects are especially notable on the state and local employment levels. So we find that for each $855,000 in federal assistance, one state and local government job was preserved. We do not find much of an effect at all on broader macroeconomic measures like private sector employment, output, consumption, and the like. Now, $855,000 per job preserved is a high number. It's even our lower bound is higher than what people have typically found for, say, the Paycheck Protection Program during this crisis or for federal support during previous downturns. But I think overall, this is a sign that probably too much funding went to state and local governments throughout this crisis.
The federal government, ultimately sent state and local governments around $1 trillion spread across four major pieces of relief legislation. And some of the ways that we know that this was ultimately a substantial overshoot are first, that state and local governments have been trying to figure out how to spend down the dramatic surpluses that they've been realizing. And they've been doing so through a variety of actions, that have included contemplating gas tax holidays, sending out additional stimulus checks, and cutting tax rates, all of which are sort of uncoupled from the core functions that this aid was really meant to facilitate, which related to the delivery of and distribution of vaccines, tests, and educational services that are so crucial in terms of the roles of the state and local governments. So where did this $1 trillion figure come from? Well, in addition to being around an impressive sounding number, $1 trillion is roughly what some analysts had forecast for the shortfalls that state and local governments would experience in the very, very early days of the pandemic. And this number turned out to be a dramatic overshoot for two primary reasons. The first is that the macroeconomy would ultimately significantly outperform the direst forecasts that had been made in the early days of the pandemic, such that some of the needs that had been forecast simply didn't materialize, due in part to the substantial relief that the federal government had provided to households and businesses. And second, these particular forecasts were estimated using the historical relationship between the unemployment rate and state and local government budget outcomes. And it turns out that the historical relationship between the unemployment rate and state and local revenues and expenditure needs was a fairly poor predictor of the relationship between economic activity and state and local government budgets during the pandemic. The main reason for that being that unemployment during the pandemic was driven so heavily by declines in employment in relatively low-paying industries, such that their implications for total income, total consumption were much smaller than they may have been in historical recessionary environments. So the good news, I think, is that the formulas that the federal government can use to determine how much aid it delivers to state and local governments need not base the aid that it delivers on projections of state and local shortfalls that are based on, estimates from the very earliest stages of a recession or a future pandemic. Instead, the assistance can be based on the actual experience of the macroeconomy over the course of the crisis. So in the context of the pandemic, this one step alone would have reduced the overshoot of the federal assistance likely by several $100 billion, bringing the assistance much closer in line with actual realized state and local needs. And the second point is that similarly, the formulas that are used need not be based on the historical relationship between the unemployment rate and state and local revenue and expenditure needs. Instead, what we propose in our chapter is that the formulas for calculating the federal assistance be based on macroeconomic variables or outcomes that are much more closely tied to the tax bases on which state and local governments rely. So if we want to forecast shortfalls in state and local income tax revenues, those forecasts can be based on what's happening with the performance of aggregate income as opposed to the unemployment rate. And similarly, if we want to forecast shortfalls in state and local government sales tax revenues, those forecasts can be based on the performance of various measures of consumption, again, as opposed to basing those forecasts on the historical relationship between those revenue streams and the unemployment rate.
Yeah, so we described three different options in our paper. They all have the goal of implementing the kind of revenue stabilization that Jeff explained previously, where the goal is to provide more support to state and local governments during downturns, less support during boom times. The three forms that can take in our chapter are: one, a system of grants, very similar to what has been done in a more discretionary fashion so far. And so, that just means you write larger grants when the economy is not doing well. Second option is a system of loans, right? And so that has, I think, the advantage over the grant system that it more automatically leads to reduced transfers during boom times, right? There's always a risk that politicians are more comfortable providing additional support than cutting back when that additional support is no longer necessary. The downside of this loans option is that it may run into trouble at the state level with the various statutory and constitutional requirements that state operating budgets be balanced. The third option, and sort of by a process of elimination, I think this is the preferred option of the three, is a revenue model where the states pay, something you can think of as insurance premia during good times, and then they receive a payout that lets them stabilize their revenue during downturns. So those are the three options. I think the third option is preferable to a grant system because it doesn't have the same level of commitment issues. I think it's preferable to a loan system because it doesn't run the risk of running into these legal issues that I've described.